Hey everyone, today I wanted to look back at the year of 2023 for Dead by Daylight, and specifically the chapters of content that released this year, recapping, reviewing, and doing some retrospection. The year started off in a fairly rough way, with us coming off the back of the Forged in Fog chapter, a chapter that was received with a fairly flat response. No one really cared for it, featuring a character who once again focused on anti-loop, and incorporated at the time a rather inconsistent feeling AI. The chapter itself was visually good looking, with the Knight and Vittorio being interesting enough characters. The map was a total flop though, being way too bright and way too survivor-sided, so it wasn't the best way to enter the new year. Hype had died down very quickly for Forged in Fog, so a lot was expected for the next chapter. There weren't too many leaks early in the year to the best of my memory, or at all this year for that matter. It was nice in that way, as most things revealed were a surprise. The teasers for chapter 27 seemed promising, with a sci-fi seeming theme. People's hopes were up. They began theorizing ideas about robot killers and stuff like that. However, when the chapter did get revealed, a lot of this hype died out fairly quickly, as what was released was one of the most controversial chapters we've ever had. Tools of Torment. Before discussing the negatives of this chapter, I do want to relay some positives. First off, the Lyra siblings are both genuinely solid characters. I enjoyed having a multi-survivor original chapter, and I appreciated how they interlinked the two of their stories. Additionally, I still believe the idea of transforming the map of Shelter Woods and altering it slightly, but not completely, for the Skull Merchant's arrival was a good plan. The map nowadays is still sort of problematic, but it's definitely fairer and simply less empty. If future maps that are currently an issue can be sort of semi-fixed in this way, then I'm all for it. The negatives came in the form of mainly just the killer, the Skull Merchant. Skull Merchant wasn't quite the robot killer people were expecting, but instead a character with a rather confusing backstory that seemed like a bit of a mess of ideas. Her visual design also wasn't received too well, with her odd combination of different themes and elements. For me, that's still her biggest issue, is she just feels a bit all over the place. The other issue was that her power played in greatly to a big issue at the time of 3-genning, and in general the gen regression meta. Skull Merchant was almost built for holding a 3-gen it seems, with her drone power enabling her to track survivors and make them exposed if they got too close. This wasn't really quote-unquote fixed upon live release either. I personally remember my first game against her on RPD, and it went on for at least 20 to 30 minutes. All of it felt like a bad sign for the year ahead, with priorities feeling a bit out of place and the community being generally just drained from two back-to-back poorly received chapters. Our saving grace, however, came in the form of chapter 28 for the 7th anniversary of the game, End Transmission. Before we talk about that though, I'd like to introduce G Fuel's brand new mystery flavor, White Elephant, and they've tasked us with what the flavor could be. I've tried it and my best guess so far is something with orange or lime. The flavor also tastes great. You can further enter into a $10,000 sweepstake over on the G Fuel website by simply guessing what the flavor might be. So be sure to go enter and pick yourself up a White Elephant tub. You can even get 20% off your order with use of my affiliate link or code AZHY at checkout. Happy guessing. End Transmission essentially felt like a fulfillment of what most people wanted for Tools of Torment upon hearing it had sci-fi elements. End Transmission took us to a new place Dead by Daylight had never really gone before, and in a quite literal way, with the map being on a different planet, our survivor being a clone, and the killer being a sentient robot. Everything about this chapter was exciting and felt like a final realization of the potential that had been missed up to this point of exploring horror sci-fi. The map felt fresh and new, and for the first time in a while it released in a pretty fair state actually. Dvarka has some issues, but for the most part it's fairly balanced. Singularity struggled a bit in terms of strength through the PTB and briefly in live, but once things were ironed out, he came out the other end as a fairly moderate character. Complex and difficult, but balanced. Gabriel Soma was an interesting enough character, but his real impact came in the form of a controversial new perk into the meta, made for this. It was around this time when lots more haste-related builds began appearing, and in general haste just seemed to be getting tacked on to lots of things, as the gen kick meta began to fade. Made for this mainly was an issue, I think, because it affected the weakest killers the most, and didn't do too much for the stronger ones, creating a lot of frustration and division. I also think a big reason for this perk's polarity was that it required no skill to use, being entirely passive. It was a bit like Old Iron Will, you just whacked it on and it worked for you. You didn't really need to do much. The other surprising thing that happened, and was leaked just slightly before its release, was Nicolas Cage. Still something that is utterly bizarre to me. We have Nicolas Cage in Dead by Daylight. This was a fun reveal and subsequent release. I basically have nothing bad to say about this. It was a refreshing and enjoyable release with nothing to complain about, and a bunch of fun perks to mess around with. A really nice pit stop and sort of breath of fresh air, where it just really felt like the half chapter was about having fun. The next two chapters were said to be licensed and with a capital L. Hopes were really high because of this, and they certainly weren't joking, with chapter 29 being Alien, possibly the biggest license we've ever actually gotten in the game. This was exciting, and to be honest, a slight surprise to me because we'd just got an end transmission, a sci-fi themed chapter. Regardless, it was exciting. This DLC was clearly made with a lot of care, with the many cool animations and small details present. I will say though that for this chapter it felt like the hype died down pretty fast. For me at least, I struggled to, and still struggle to, enjoy AZHYMOVS' power. The chapter had a lot of care, but for me I think sort of lacked when it came to the gameplay side. With that said, there were equally really great gameplay additions like AZHYMOVS Tunnels, which really pushed things to new limits for DBD. We've never really had a whole other area before made just for a character's power. The other huge positive of this chapter I think was the Nostromo map, another solid addition this year. In general, the maps this year were a whole lot better than previous years, by quite a bit I would say. Moving on to the final piece of content this year, the Chucky chapter. This came as a surprise to pretty much everyone. I don't think anyone guessed this would be coming, with it even previously being explicitly stated to not be coming, I think, with the leading theory being Predator for the most part, post the Aliens release. This is another way in which DBD made a big step in the right direction, I think. Chucky's power and general gameplay, to me, is some of the most unique we've ever gotten, in part just for his third-person perspective. It sort of just feels like a whole different game with him. This chapter also had so much attention to detail, and really solidified, in my mind at least, that this game would be a lot better off if we had a reduction in content, but a hopefully subsequent rise in quality. Taking the beginning and ending chapter of the year, comparing the amount of content, but the quality of that content, outlines this pretty well, I think. In the new year, I sort of hope we get more time spent refining the current content of the game, and the time that is spent releasing new content is spent on a smaller amount of content, optimizing it to begin with so it can release and seamlessly fit in with the current content. Personally, one of DBD's biggest issues at the moment is that it has an overabundance of stuff in the game, to the point where there simply isn't enough time to keep up with adjustments to the old things, because new stuff is always being added. As much as I like the new content, I would prefer a better, balanced, and stabler game. Overall, I enjoyed this year of content on the whole. It was a good year for both licenses and original content. I know that's going to be a bit of a contested comment, but to be honest, I think Skull Merchant was the only real misfire of the year, and even since her release, many steps have been taken to get her into a better spot. That's sort of my point about smaller releases though. Instead of getting Skull Merchant into a better spot this year, that time could have been spent on older characters if she'd just released in a good state to begin with. The rest of the content of the year on the whole was really good. Even Skull Merchant's current state is pretty okay, I think. One thing I think worthy of praise is the attention to detail and high quality of many of the chapters. I also loved how they explored new things this year when it came to the content. We finally got to get some sci-fi horror stuff, and we got maps that featured environments from other planets aside Earth. I felt very satisfied in that sense, and happy that there was more experimentation this year with powers, environments, and even perks too. Nicolas Cage is a perfect example of just introducing something different but ultimately fun. He came at a perfect time when the game was in great need of just some new fun content. I really hope we get similar surprises like this in years to come, although it's going to be hard to top, I think. What did you think of this year of Dead by Daylight? Let me know down below. Thanks, and goodbye. Bye.